So, question 3, toward the end of the introductory section of his article, Gladwell writes, "There's something else at work here in the outsized enthusiasm for social media." So, what does outsized mean here? And what does his use of this word reveal to us about his attitude towards social media? Okay, and basically, these questions that we're seeing on the quizzes, they're helping us get used to the kind of questions that we want to ask about a text as we're reading it in order to analyze it. And so thinking about, okay, so he chose the word outsized, and how does that serve as a clue, right? So we're always looking for these clues, choice of words or images, a phrase that clue us in on how the writer feels about the kind of ideas that they're laying out, right? Whether they're agreeing or disagreeing with the sources they're bringing in. So for outsized, right, in terms of our hypothesis assignment when we did the annotations, right, so you look that up and you get, basically it means large, right? Also, it can mean exaggerated. And so certainly in this context, he's saying, look, this enthusiasm for social media, right, on behalf of these digital evangelists, right, it's exaggerated, right? Uh, it's they're giving it more credit um, for performing social activism than it deserves, right? So that sense of exaggerated. Okay, and we shift down to question 4. So 50 years after one of the most extraordinary episodes of social upheaval in American history, we seem to have forgotten what social activism is, writes Gladwell. Okay, and so basically that serves as Gladwell's thesis. So if we take a look again at our annotated version, so we get the example of the Greensboro 4, the lunch counter protest, how it spreads, and we get an indication, a clue here about um, his attitude toward social media's role in activism by saying, okay, look, so this really successful protest that spread like wildfire, started with 4 people, it ended up being 70,000, spanned across the South. So it happened without email, texting, Facebook, or Twitter, without social media. Right, and so we get the sense that he's going to be critical, and that's the sense we originally got in the title, right? So again, I can't emphasize how helpful titles can be, right? So when you're working through your first, second, third reading, come back to that title and see how it frames the text, right? So that idea of small change, why the revolution will not be tweeted, right? So true revolutionary social change is not going to happen on Twitter. It's not going to happen on social media. The kind of social activism that takes place on social media is small change, not fundamental change that changes the status quo, which is what Gladwell wants to see and is what we saw in the civil rights. And that's why the civil rights movement is his main example. Okay. So he sets up that example, right? It's spreading, and we move through, okay, here are all these people so enthusiastic about social media. However, that's puzzling because these are actually not accurate claims on behalf of social media's ability to enact social change, right? These claims are grandiose. And so we come here to the thesis statement. 50 years after one of the most extraordinary episodes of social upheaval in American history. So in other words, the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and so the Greensboro 4, also the Montgomery bus boycott, when he talks about the NAACP, Martin Luther King Jr., those are all figures and individual protests within this larger civil rights movement that took place in the 60s. Okay, so he's saying, okay, that was an extraordinary example of social activism, right? And 50 years later, with all these people saying, "Oh, social media is so great! Look at all this social change that's happening," he's saying, "Hey, they seem to have forgotten what activism is, right? If they're calling these social media examples activism, they've forgotten what that word means." Right. And so we're getting that placeholder for his argument. We get his viewpoint. And then we always want to look later in the article for a fuller expression of argument. Right. So he's going to get more specific after the thesis statement. Right. So, okay, we've forgotten what activism is. So we can expect that in the rest of the article, he's going to tell us what true, real social activism is, right? And he's going to bring in key terms to help us understand what that is. Okay, so that brings us to part B of question 4. So how does his use, what is going on? Sorry, there's typo there. Um, So how does he, or sorry, I'm not reading it correctly. How does he use this episode of the civil rights movement to illustrate what he thinks social activism truly is, what it actually is, right? As opposed to what he thinks true activism is not. Okay, so here I'm going to pause you again, another opportunity to score some extra points on the first reading quiz. And so go back to our annotated version of Gladwell and review our annotations. And what I'd like you to do is to come up with 3 key terms that Gladwell uses to describe or to define what he feels true social activism really is. Okay, so again, one of our strategies for generating really strong and effective and specific and successful quiz responses is to be as specific as possible and to bring in those key terms where they're relevant, right? So this is a perfect time to bring them in to make your responses accurate and specific as possible. So as he's defining real and true social media, or sorry, not social media activism, just social activism, what key terms does he bring in? Okay, and so we'll pause it here so you have a chance to review those annotations and to earn some extra points. Okay, so we'll come back to the key terms that would be appropriate for answering question 4 successfully, because question 5 is related. So question 5, activism that challenges the status quo, that attacks deeply rooted problems is not for the faint of heart, Gladwell argues. Okay, so this quotation is a great example of an idea quotation, right? So here, actually, Gladwell is defining for us what he considers to be true, real social activism, right? So it's activism that challenges the status quo, and he defines the status quo within the same quotation, right? So the status quo. So activism that challenges the status quo is activism that attacks deeply rooted problems, right? And so it's not for the faint of heart. So in other words, you know, you're not going to be able to just kind of, use PayPal and send $20 to some organization to attack the status quo, right? To attack deeply rooted problems. That's not what we're looking at here. There has to be more. And so for B, how does the example of the 4 freshmen at the Greensboro lunch counter, or the Greensboro 4, as he refers to them later in the article, illustrate this claim, right? That really, attacking deeply rooted social problems is not for the faint of heart, right? It's not for those who aren't really willing to kind of risk anything, right? Okay, and so what 2 key terms does Gladwell use to analyze the example of the Greensboro 4, and how do these key terms support the claim that he makes in the quotation above? Okay, so what I'd like for you to do here, again, go back to our annotated version of Gladwell, look at those annotations, and list the 2 key terms that Gladwell introduces by way of the Greensboro 4. Right? So when he dives, and he goes back to that example multiple times. So at the introduction, that's how he starts the essay, right? He gives us this example of the successful protest that, again, spreads like wildfire, all without social media, right? And then he introduces, okay, here are all these people that love social media, say it's great at social activism. However, I'm going to poke holes in that by way of social or digital evangelist critics and pose my thesis that, okay, we've forgotten what social activism is. And now I'm going to bring back in the Greensboro 4, one protest within the larger umbrella of the civil rights movement, to demonstrate for you and help to define what I consider real world activism, true activism, right? And so we see that activism with the Greensboro Four. Okay, so what key terms, two key terms then, does he bring in to when he discusses the Greensboro Four? Okay, so I'll give you a few minutes to review the annotations and to earn some extra points on the quiz.